Well, good afternoon, folks. It's a little flock. Of course, we've got a larger flock out there on the other side of that camera. So, we've got a big flock. Monday, I believe, was Columbus Day. And up there in Washington, they've got this statue of Columbus set up, and we give honor to Columbus. But you know, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, etc., etc. We all learned that little poem in our history classes just a few years ago. But most people today don't know who Christopher Columbus was. And they don't even know what we were taught in school, you know, about Christopher Columbus. And even what we were taught in school wasn't the whole story. Columbus was credited with discovering the New World. However, we know there was people here when he arrived. So he really didn't discover it, only in the sense that he made it known to the European people. Columbus, he was not even an Englishman. He was an Italian explorer. And he discovered the New World of the Americas on an expedition sponsored by King Ferdinand of Spain in 1492. He wasn't actually looking for new land. He was looking for a shorter route to the West Indies. Now, he was first rejected by the Portuguese king. He petitioned the Portuguese king to sponsor his 3-ship voyage of discovery. However, he was rejected. So he took his plan to Venice, but he was rejected there also. He then went to the Spanish monarchy of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand in 1486. And their nautical experts were a little skeptical of what he wanted to do, and initially Columbus was rejected there as well. The idea, however, intrigued the Spanish monarchs. So they kept Columbus on hold for a while because they were involved in something else at the time. They were in a war with the Muslims, themselves being devout Catholics, of course. So Columbus would have to wait a while. Columbus continued, however, to lobby the royal court, and soon after the Spanish army captured the last Muslim stronghold in 1492, the monarchs finally agreed to sponsor his expedition. And therefore, as we know, the New World was found. And like I say, that wasn't the whole story, though. And I'm not going to get into how he established a forced labor policy over the native population to build a settlement and to search for gold, and how he was once stripped of his authority and taken back to Spain in chains to face the Spanish courts. That's stuff that we weren't taught in school. Because, you know, I've said enough to establish the fact that his discoveries did open up the New World to the Europeans. So, while moving some of my stuff around the other day from one corner to another, and we all know how that goes, as I was moving some books, I dropped one, and it happened to be a history book. It had fell open to a certain place, and as I picked it up, I glanced over one of the pages where some information had been recorded about John Winthrop. Now that struck a chord in the back of my mind somewhere, because it brought back memories of studying about American history way back when I was in high school. So as I was reading, I decided to write a short sermon on the circumstances and how they fell in place to bring us to the point as a nation of where we are today. As you read about the history of the early American colonists, you can see they sincerely believed they had a divinely appointed destiny and thought of themselves as being chosen for a special mission in the world. In 1630, John Winthrop, the fellow I just mentioned, he was a wealthy English Puritan lawyer. He was a lawyer, and he was also the governor of the first major settlement after the Plymouth colony in what is now New England. This is what he said. He said, "We shall find that the God of Israel is among us, and the eyes of all people are upon us." Now, if you went out and interviewed 1,000 people today, how many of those people would tell you that they and their fellow Americans had a divinely appointed destiny in the history of mankind? How many of these people would tell you they felt their nation had been chosen for a special mission in the world? A lot of the younger generation don't even know where we come from, much less where we're going. When the Pilgrims waded ashore at Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620, according to their first governor, William Bradford, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them from all the perils and miseries and planted them in this new land. They knew that somehow in the back of their minds that it was of God. And America's Great Seal, I had one there a while ago. I don't know what I've done with it. I offered it to David. But America's Great Seal, as you can see on the back of a $1 bill, it illustrates the eye of God above the Egyptian pyramid, depicting God delivering his people out of Egyptian bondage on their pilgrimage to the Promised Land. That's what it represents. Above the Egyptian pyramid, the words Anet and Anut, I'm not saying that right, I know, Anut Coptis, which is Latin for He. It means He, the great God. That's what that means. He, the great God, has favored our undertakings. And the early Americans believed God's eye was on their undertakings. But American people, sadly to say, no longer believe that. Our leaders, along with the atheists, has undermined this idea that we, in America, have a divinely appointed destiny. Our present administration even wants us, that is, the most powerful nation in the world, to lower ourselves down to the same standards of everyone else, so we won't appear to be the bullies of the world. He goes around apologizing to the rest of the world for our greatness. That's sad. When in fact, he has no idea himself of how we came to be the way we are. The historical account of how America was won, of how the struggling colonists from Europe were planted on the shores of this continent, and how they succeeded in establishing the earth's mightiest nation, it's an interesting, gripping story if you think about it. And it's a mystery to me is how anyone can take a look at how we came to be this way and deny that there was somehow a higher power involved. Winston Churchill, we all know who that was. Winston Churchill, while speaking at a dinner held in his honor in New York City in 1949, he acknowledged that America had, quote, he said, arrived at the summit of the world, or the peak of the world. So what was it which brought America's rise to greatness? How did we gain our vast wealth and power? How could this comparative latecomer on the world scene rise so swiftly to such an unprecedented pinnacle of economic and military power, dwarfing all other nations in the process? Did it just happen by luck? Did things just fall into place at the right times? Or was there something else behind the bringing of America's rise to greatness? How did we get our vast wealth and our vast power? How could this comparative latecomer on the world scene rise so swiftly to such a pinnacle of economic and military power, dwarfing all other countries that has ever existed before it, even the mighty Roman Empire? We are a young nation compared to other nations, past or present. We are only about 240 years old, and it boggles the mind as to how we arrived where we are so fast. The Roman Empire, I believe, was over 500 years old before its demise, and the eastern half of the Roman Empire was longer than that. However, we are beginning to come unraveled in only half of that time, about half of the time that they existed. Some historians, and especially the politicians, would have us believe that our fabulous wealth and our awesome power is primarily the result of our own ingenuity and luck. Is that so? Is that how we got here? Did we, by luck, just happen to inherit the earth's goodliest heritage as far as the blending of the earth's most productive land, the most favorable climate, and the most favorable placed landmass, which, unlike the nations of Europe, is so located as to prevent it from being overrun by powerful neighboring states around it? Or has an unseen hand guided this nation from its inception in 1607, when the struggling colonists from England established their first toehold in the New World? Few Americans realized that there was a three-power struggle being waged at that time. During the course of 2 centuries, for the control of the vast land mass of North America, there was a struggle going on. There was Spain, there was France, and there was Britain, all of which was seeking to the control of this rich continent. And, you know, most people today don't realize that. For history is not taught in our schools anymore. And if it is distorted from what the true historians have left us. Now, I know history has sometimes been embellished a little bit on the part of some of these historians in order to make things appear a little more romantic. But when you compare them all side by side, what they've left us and what they had to say, for the most part, it coincides. It makes sense. It agrees. They all agree on the main things. So in the same year Columbus made his epic voyage to the West Indies, that's 1492, what he thought was the West Indies, I'm sorry. But when he made this voyage and he explored this new land, Pope Alexander VI, listen to this, Pope Alexander VI granted to Spain and Portugal all of North, Central, and South America. After learning of the discovery of the previously unknown lands of the New World, Pope Alexander decided the best way to prevent rivalry and bloodshed between Spain and Portugal was to divide the newly acquired or newly discovered world between them. Accordingly, he drew an imaginary line from north to south through a point several hundred miles west of the present-day Atlantic islands called the Azores. And you'd have to get out a map and look at all this to understand what I'm saying. But all the land to the east of this line of demarcation went to Portugal. And all of the land west fell to to Spain. However, there was a treaty signed between Spain and Portugal in 1493, and this line of demarcation was moved slightly farther west. So the only territory in the New World which was assigned to Portugal was the big eastern bulge of the South American continent, roughly corresponding to present-day Brazil. All the rest of the territory in the New World went to the Spaniards. So this meant Spain was given all of North and Central America and most of South America. However, there was a major problem with this imaginary division of the New World. Britain, France, and Holland just didn't believe any man, king, pope, or whatever, had the God-given right to give away such vast amounts of the earth's unclaimed real estate. And for what it's worth, I don't think he did either. It didn't belong to him. It belonged to God. But that shows us the mentality of the Catholic Church. They think they should own the world. And that has forever been their quest, to bring the whole world under the rule of the Catholic Church. And there's another great religion, the radical Islamic faith, who wants to do the same thing, to bring the whole world under their rule as well. And right before the second coming of Christ, you will see these two great religions clash in an effort to do that very thing. But back to the story here. Britain, France, and Holland ignored the Pope's line of demarcation when it came to establishing at a later date colonies in the New World. I'm pronouncing that wrong. Demarcation. Forgive me. It's the door's fault. Later, however, a real struggle for possession of North America developed between Britain and Spain. And as fabulous amounts of gold and silver began to flow from the New World, primarily from Mexico and Peru, back to Europe, back to Spain. And this aroused the curiosity of many nations. So greedy adventurers wanted to get their hands on some of this seemingly unlimited treasure. At this point in history, England produced some daring men of the sea, such as Sir Francis Drake and Sir John Hawkins. And these bold adventurers began to plunder the Spanish treasure ships, which, you know, was no less than out-and-out stealing and robbery is what it was. They were letting the Spanish dig it out of the ground and put it on the ships, and they were taking it away from them. Of course, King Philip II of Spain, he didn't appreciate this interference with his lucrative flow of wealth from the New World. And this very Catholic monarch, he didn't like the way religious matters were going in England and Holland either, where Protestants were gaining the upper hand. So, and they were the ones that were stealing from him as well. So King Philip, therefore, decided to send his mighty, invincible armada against England to subjugate the tiny island kingdom. And after subjugating the English, he planned to bring the Protestants, of Holland, into subjection also. So here we see again the Catholics trying to bring other nations under their rule and their religion. And it's going to happen again, folks. Well, those of us who know our history know that it didn't happen at that time, did it? In the summer of 1588, Philip's mighty armada was outfitted and ready to sail for England. About 28,000 Spaniards were in the attack force. But during the ensuing battle, the greatly outnumbered and outgunned British seamen were aided greatly by the weather, and they defeated the Spaniards. Now, this is important to understand about how we came to be. It may not seem so, but it is. Only about half of Philip's badly battered ships and men limped back to Spain. And from that day forward, England knew she could successfully challenge the the Spaniards on the high seas. But did that just happen by chance? Or was there a higher power at work in all of this? For if the Spaniards had succeeded in their quest, there would be no Great Britain, of whence we came from. It would still be under Spanish rule today. And there would be no colonization of the New World by the descendants of Abraham. And if there's anyone out there who doesn't understand that we are modern-day Israelites, most of us here understand that. But you can write to this church, and we will send you something to explain all that. One of England's greatest historians, as I've already mentioned, Sir Winston Churchill, he commented on the defeat of this Spanish Armada. He said, "To the English people as a whole, the defeat of the Armada came as a miracle. One of the medals struck to commemorate the victory bears the inscriptions," and I'm going to mispronounce this as well. It's Latin as well. "Flavit Deus et Dissipatur." Now I know that's not how it's pronounced, but it means God blew and they were scattered. So the British people give credit to God for that defeat. Elizabeth and her seamen knew how true this was. The Armada had indeed been bruised in battle, but it was demoralized and set on the run by the weather. Yet the event was decisive. These are also the words of Winston Churchill, taken from the book, A History of English-Speaking Peoples. He said, "From that time forward, English felt she could safely induce settlements into North America without the fear of Spain being able to destroy them." So, in 1607, the first permanent English colony was planted at Jamestown, Virginia, which it would not have been if the Spanish had won that battle. And before long, 13 thriving colonies were established in North America by the British. Now, years before the English colonies in the New World, the Spaniards had colonies in Florida, Texas, and the southwestern part of North America. But these Spanish colonies never came into serious conflict with the British ones to their north. It was with France that Britain was soon to be engaged with in a bloody struggle for the supremacy of North America. Years before England commenced her first permanent colony in 1607, French explorers had sailed up the St. Lawrence River, deep into what was to become Canada. And eventually these wide-ranging French explorers navigated the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi River, claiming all of North America west of the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains, and all the parts east to the Allegheny Mountains, which we know as the Appalachian Mountains, we're a part of. That's what the French claimed. This vast, unbelievable, fertile land lying to the east and west of the Mississippi was called Louisiana, after the French king, Louis XIV. However, the British finally won the French and Indian War in 1763, and the Treaty of Paris was signed, and France ceded to Britain all of her territory in Canada, plus all the land east of the Mississippi, from Canada in the north to Florida Territory in the south. So the French gave that to us as being the victors, or they gave it to the British, I'm sorry. Interesting enough, when France was defeated by England, She offered the victor either the islands of Guadeloupe in the West Indies or Canada as their prize for winning the war. Fortunately, Benjamin Franklin happened to be in London at the time, and he realized the vast potential of the Canadian territory. He therefore wrote a pamphlet in which he urged the British to take Canada rather than the sugar and rum-rich Caribbean island. And many Britons were disappointed with their government when they followed Franklin's advice and chose Canada rather than Guadeloupe. Now, not long after this Treaty of Paris had granted Britain all of French Canada, plus the present-day states of Mississippi from Canada to the Florida Territory, trouble broke out between the 13 colonies and England. On July the 4th, which we celebrate today, still celebrate July the 4th today, although most Americans don't know why. On July the 4th, 1776, the 13 colonies declared their independence from Britain and began waging the American Revolutionary War to secure their freedom. All odds favored a British victory in that war. But Cornwallis was defeated at Yorktown on October the 19th, 1781, by the combined forces of Washington working with the French Navy. And that meant that America would soon gain total independence. So there's something working here, as we can see. A higher power working here. In 1783, Britain granted to the new United States not only the title deed to the original 13 colonies, but also gave those colonies all the land from the Atlantic west to the Mississippi River. That is all the land between Canada in the north and Florida Territory in the south, which comprises about 1/3 of our nation today. Beginning with this first title grant, the United States went on to eventually acquire all the land encompassed in the continuous 48 states. And how America acquired all of this land during a 70-year period is one of the most fascinating stories to be found in the history of any nation. In fact, there is no other similar parallel in all the world's history as to what happened to us. At no other time did a nation ever acquire such a vast, rich, strategic tract of land in such a short period of time. After acquiring all the land east of the Mississippi, other events began moving rather swiftly to give her possession of the vast Louisiana Territory west of the Mississippi, which was owned by the French. And here's the story of how America acquired that land. One of the most fabulous land bargains in the history of the entire world. During the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, the vain, ambitious Napoleon, he first planned to establish a French empire west of the Mississippi to counterbalance the Anglo-Saxon, or the British, dominated territory of Canada and the United States east of the Mississippi. So he was going to establish an empire here in America. But Napoleon's ambitions knew no bounds as he continued to expand his empire across Europe, which was his main concern at the moment. And he realized he would need money to wage that war, primarily against Britain. So Napoleon therefore concluded that if he would sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States, this would provide him badly needed money for his war in Europe, and at the same time would cause America to be friendly towards him. And it just so happened, that U.S. President Thomas Jefferson had recently instructed the American ministers in Paris to see if the U.S. could buy the port of New Orleans from France, or at least some land on the eastern side of the mouth of the Mississippi, so we could establish a port there by which we could then secure an outlet for our goods, which flowed down the Mississippi and from there to Europe. Neither Jefferson nor his American representatives in Paris dreamed that Napoleon would not only sell them the valuable port of New Orleans, but would offer to sell them all the Louisiana Territory west of the Mississippi River for the paltry sum of only $15 million. Now, I know that was a lot of money back then, but when you add that up, folks, figure that up, this purchase amounted to about 4 cents an acre, which is almost another third of the whole United States. We purchased for $15 million. Never in the history of the world has such a fantastic purchase been made. This fabulous acquisition included all or parts of 11 states and some of the most fertile land in the world. Just happened, some folks says. This vast territory was later divided into Arkansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Iowa, South Dakota, and parts of Colorado, Kansas, Minnesota, North Dakota, Oklahoma, and Wyoming. All bought for 4 cents an acre. Almost 1/3 of the whole nation as we know it today. Do we think it was just luck? Or again, were there some other higher force guiding our destiny as a nation? Shortly thereafter, in 1819, America was successful in purchasing the Florida Territory, including Florida and parts of what we know as Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi for the insignificant sum of $10 million. Now, America owned all of the land east of the Mississippi from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, plus the land called the Louisiana Territory, stretching west from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains. So now we can begin to see how little by little, how everything begins to fall in place, is how we gained the land, which is now called the United States of America. In 1836, the Texans declared their independence from Mexico and established the Lone Star Republic. The U.S. didn't want to offend Mexico at that time, and therefore it didn't permit Texas to be admitted immediately into the Union. However, the U.S. finally did annex Texas in 1845, and this proved to be one more irritation between Mexico and America, which finally led to the Mexican War, and that was in 1846 to 1847. Also in 1846 as well, Britain and the United States finally settled their border disputes in the Northwest. Prior to this date, Britain had claimed the territory of Oregon and Washington. Whereas the U.S. had claimed all of that territory plus British Columbia. But rather to come to blows again, fighting again, both Britain and America agreed that all the land above the 49th parallel, which ran between U.S. and British Northwest Territory, would be British, and all to the south would be U.S. territory except Vancouver Island, which would remain under the British flag. And that is where the boundary line remains today, between Canada and the U.S. in the Northwest. So, in the mid-1800s, many Americans started to firmly believe in America's manifest destiny, which is believing America was destined to inherit all the land from the Atlantic to the Pacific. We weren't hardly there yet, but that's what Americans believed, that we should possess it all. Now, 6 of the original 13 colonies had received royal grants given them to sea rights from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And those states were Massachusetts, Connecticut, Virginia, North, South Carolina, and Georgia. But in actual practice, these royal grants only extended westward to the Mississippi River, since France and Spain claimed all of the land west of the Mississippi during America's early history. It was during the 1840s that this idea of manifest destiny began to sweep the nation. This manifest destiny is a persistent and cherished tradition of U.S. history, which in its broadest conception declared that Americans are chosen people, blessed with the free institutions and ordained by God to create a model society in the wilderness. That's what this manifest destiny is. Does that strike a note in your mind? It should, if you've ever read the Bible. In Genesis 12, 1 through 3, the Lord speaking to Abraham when he first called him to go out into a strange land, said this. God told Abraham, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless you, and curse him that curses you. And in you shall all families of the earth be blessed. And yes, all the people of the earth will be blessed through Christ, who was born physically as the progeny of Abraham. But more than that, folks, even now, almost every nation on the earth has been blessed by the United States, the offspring of Abraham. In the past years, we have fed the world. We have propped up their economies, other nations' economies, and we have fought their battles for them. But no more. That is all coming to an end. But we have blessed the rest of the world as a nation. In Genesis 17, 1 through 8, and I'm not going to read this word for word, but here the Lord told Abraham he would make a covenant between them, and that he would multiply him exceedingly, that is Abraham, that he would become the father of many nations, or rather a multitude of nations. God told Abraham that his seed would become exceedingly fruitful, and kings would come out of him. The Lord said he would establish this covenant between Abraham and his seed and their generations for an everlasting covenant. Everlasting is forever, folks. And that we should keep this covenant throughout our generations. But we know Israel of old didn't do that, did they? The Lord brought them out of the land of Egypt. He placed them in the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey, which signifies all the good things that one could ever want. But they threw him out the window and abused all the good things he gave them until he finally scattered them throughout the world. However, eventually, in his mercy, even though he scattered them, he still placed them in the most productive places on the earth as far as food production goes. The British Isles, They're small compared to a lot of other nations. But a large portion of their land is devoted to farming, producing food, because they have good soil. Australia, no bigger than it is a major exporter of agricultural products. And Canada is one of the biggest producers and exporters of food in the world, comparable even to the United States. And even little Denmark produces enough food to feed 15 million people every year, no bigger than it is. And, of course, there's us, the United States. The Lord in His anger still put His people in the most choice places on the earth as far as resources go, because of His promise to Abraham. He has still given us the lands which flows with milk and honey. But we, like the ancient Israelites, have thrown God out the window. And we have abused what He has given us and claimed what we have as being of our own ingenuity and giving God no credit at all. That's how we are today. The Encyclopedia Britannica says this of this manifest destiny of which I spoke. It said it may have begun with the Puritan landing in Massachusetts Bay in 1630. But in its more restricted geographical sense, the phrase refers to the desire of the American colonists and the American expansionists who, in the 1840s, to extend the boundaries of the United States to the Pacific Ocean. And in 1845, and I know I'm throwing a lot of dates at you, which don't mean much, but John O'Sullivan, writing in the United States Magazine and Democratic Review, I don't know if that was a paper or what it was, but he said that the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent was allotted by providence, which is the foreseen care and guardianship of God over His creatures, for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions, and for the development of liberty and a federated self-government. He said that was given to us by God. That's what this manifest destiny is. He's saying it is our God-given destiny to spread over the whole continent of what is now the United States, and that God has given us the freedom for the development of liberty and a self-ruling government free of tyrants and dictators and powerful church leaders telling us what we must accept as our brand, that we must accept their brand of religion or face death. God has given us the freedom to choose our own view of God and our own way of worship. And sadly enough, a lot of those brands of religion is one of the things that is destroying us. So with this idea of manifest destiny beating in the hearts and minds of many Americans, it was only a matter of time until these dynamic, rambunctious, land-hungry Americans would spill over into Mexico territory, which provoked a bloody conflict with Mexico. Shouldn't have done that, probably. But during when James K. Polk was president, the politicians who were pushing for war with Mexico finally succeeded in getting what they wished for. The Mexican War started out as a mere border incident, but soon it escalated into a full-scale war. Well, we're having a border problem now, aren't we? So, in March 9th, 1847, General Winfield Scott landed a force of about 10,000 men at Veracruz and set out to capture Mexico City, which he did about 6 months later. And, of course, there was a treaty signed the following February, and Mexico agreed to cede to the United States, or give to the United States, what is now California, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico, along with parts of what was to become Colorado and Wyoming. And, of course, the United States agreed to pay Mexico $15 million for this newly acquired land. And only about 1 week before this treaty was signed, James Marshall discovered gold at Sutter's Mill, not far from San Francisco. Now think about that. He found gold at precisely the same time the U.S. acquired that land. Was that just a coincidence? Think about it. And I mean, I'm not talking about a little bit of gold. There was a lot of gold came out of California. This resulted in the famous California Gold Rush, which helped to bring a flood of settlers into that sparsely settled place. But would America be satisfied with the territory it now occupied? Hardly. America still coveted the silver of a certain Mexican territory. And the U.S. finally agreed to acquire the Gadsden Purchase from Mexico for the sum of $10 million. And with that purchase, the era comprising the original 48 states was now complete. So, we got the gold, we got the silver, and I'll show you something else we got in just a minute. But 10 years later, in the most devastating and bloody conflict to ever happen to the American people, or rather the Israelite people, came about. That was the Civil War. And this is what Abraham Lincoln said. And I know that if you study about Abraham Lincoln, he wasn't a saint either, but he was the president when all this happened. He said, "We have been the recipients of the choice bounties of heaven. We have been preserved these many years in peace and prosperity. We have grown in numbers, wealth, and power as no other nation has ever grown. But we have forgotten God," he said. "We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. And we have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtues of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us." Truer words were never spoken, and they apply to us today as well. However, unlike Abraham Lincoln, our leaders today themselves have forgotten God and have become too self-sufficient to pray, too proud to pray. On October the 3rd, 1863, Lincoln made another proclamation in which he said, "No human counsel has devised nor has any mortal hand worked out these great things. They are the gracious gifts of the Most High God, who, while dealing with us in anger for our sins, has nevertheless remembered mercy." You won't hear politicians talking like that today. And certainly not the president of the land. Then near the end of the Civil War, Lincoln issued a Thanksgiving Day proclamation in which he urged his fellow Americans to properly observe the soon coming Thanksgiving Day as a day of thanksgiving and praise to the Almighty God, the the creator and ruler of the universe. He said, and I do further recommend to my fellow citizens aforesaid that on the occasion they do reverently humble themselves in the dust, and from there offer up penitent and fervent prayers and supplications to the great disposer of events for a return, for the return of the blessings of peace, union, and harmony throughout the land, which it has pleased him to assign us a dwelling place for ourselves and for our posterity throughout all generations. You won't hear leaders speaking like that today. For they know if they do, they'll never be reelected to public office. Because it's not just the corrupt leadership who denies God today. We, the people, folks, are also corrupted and deny God. And our government is a government of we, the people. Therefore, we have no one to blame but ourselves. Again, back to the story here. Here's something you may not know. Or if you did, you may have forgotten it, like I did. I had forgotten this. Although I studied American history in school and how we came to be, I'll have to be honest. I'd forgotten about this until my research brought it back to mind. Russia, as well as Spain and France, had been grasping for control of North America. Russia had taken possession of what is now known as Alaska, claiming parts of western Canada. And in 1812 even established a thriving colony of about 400 people at Fort Russ, just north of modern-day San Francisco. San Francisco, folks, is way down towards the middle of the nation on the west coast. Didn't know the Russians were ever that close, did you? Well, blame it on the door, I guess. I've got mine mixed up here too, David. Let's see here. I know I've got another page here somewhere. But Russia sold out her California colony to John Sutter in 1841 for $30,000. Now, remember who John Sutter was. He's the one who discovered gold on his property, which caused the great California gold rush. And this was only 7 years before he did that. Then 2 years after the Civil War, Russia sold Alaska to the United States for $7,200,000, a little less than 2 cents an acre. And there was all that oil. There was all that oil. No wonder Russia don't like us today. She feels like she was cheated out of all that gold and all that oil. I myself feel like there was a higher power involved. Truly, no nation in the long history of the world has ever been so blessed as this great land we live in. Yet many Americans neither feel or express any gratitude to the great one who shapes the destinies of all nations and who has given us all these manifold blessings. Yet, while we take these blessings for granted, people in the rest of the world can see clearly how we have been blessed. And that is one of the reasons most of the world hates us, because we have been blessed by God. The late Prime Minister of Japan, K-A-K-U-E-I, however you pronounce that, Tanaka, could see this. He could sense that Americans today often take their blessings for granted. he said in late 1973, he said, "I often wonder why you Americans so worry about domestic problems when you have such an abundance of resources." He said, "Look at the American agricultural productivity. It's easy for the U.S. to expand its output whenever it wants to, whenever it chooses. We can't do that in Japan. When I compare the situation here in Japan with the situations in your country, I think that as a nation, you are too privileged." He then added, "Yes, I think God has not only been fair, I think God has not been fair in the distribution of resources of all, which is now over 7 billion people on this earth." He said God has not been fair in distributing all that. Americans have the most stable economy. They have an abundance of resources available within their own country. And they have more investments abroad than any other nation. Other nations can see this, so why can't we? When you consider the fertility of our soil, the abundance of our natural resources, and the temperate climate that we have, how can we deny that we have not been favored by heaven and by God? Without a doubt, we have. We have been blessed above all other nations. If and when we take into account our wonderful standard of living, then how can we deny the blessings of God? Now, I know some of us think we have a poor standard of living. And when you get into this old woe is me attitude, compare yourself to the rest of the world, folks, and then thank God. I get into these attitudes myself. But then I realize I've never been hungry a day in my life. Oh, my stomach's gotten empty a time or two. But that's because I just couldn't get to the food on time. I've always had clothes to wear and shoes on my feet, a roof over my head, and a good bed to sleep in. I've never had to sleep on the ground unless it was of my own choosing, on a camping trip or something. If one looks at the precious rights and freedoms guaranteed by our Constitution and government, even though they are now slowly being taken away from us, but if we look at the freedoms we've had, then we will have to conclude that we have been highly favored of God as a nation. But I fear, folks, that we are nearing that red line. Will we give thanks to the great being who gave us all these blessings, or will we say, my power and my might has gotten me this wealth? Are we as a people willing to give God credit for all these wonderful blessings? America needs to be mindful of the true source of all her many, of all these wonderful blessings. Deuteronomy 8:18 tells us, "But you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He that gives you power and great wealth." So how was America won? Did we win it by our own wisdom, our own knowledge, and our own might? No, folks. It was won only because it was the will of the Almighty God. He was faithful to His promise to Abraham, and because He loves us. He loves us as a people. Where is our love towards the Almighty?